Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Alignment Recess. I am Tiffany Lauren Jones, and this space is for conversations that meet you in the transition most people try to skip over. Today, we're talking about something many of us have felt but haven't had language for, which is career grief, the emotional weight that builds up after years of overfunctioning, disappointment, burnout, or identity loss at work. And I am joined by Nyam Adodoadji, a tech consultant turned sabbatical coach and writer who guides people through transformative career breaks. After 14 years in tech and consulting, she took her own 1 year long sabbatical or longer, we'll find out, traveling across continents and finally making space to process the grief she carried silently through her career. Now she helps others do the same with rituals, questions, and practices that invite people into healing and deep transformation from the inside out. So please join me in welcoming Yang. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here and to have this conversation.
Me as well. I always love to tell my guests, I've introduced you, but there's nothing like telling your own story. I'd love to hear a little bit about you, how you got here, what your life was like before you took your sabbatical, and we can go from there.
Yeah, I describe myself as a sabbatical coach. So essentially a companion to folks who are in mid-career to help them clarify what's most important to them through the avenue of intentional career breaks, transition, sabbaticals. And in terms of how I got here, I'll start by saying I'll go back to the beginning of my career, and I graduated from college, and I was very much a kinda sensitive, artsy, creative girly. Yep, and I thought I was gonna go into, like, nonprofit or ministry work. I stumbled into Silicon Valley, which is very
Wow.
different.
How do you stumble into Silicon Valley? We'll get into that later.
Yeah, it's a good question, so
You have to be really smart, I think. Yeah.
I ended up at a startup. That was at my first job, and it was this dual experience of, on one hand, experiencing, "Oh, wow, I'm really capable and
Right.
achieving what I think a lot of folks would define as, wow, that's really impressive." But it was also the first entry point for me experiencing depression, anxiety, and turned into multiple rounds of burnout throughout my 14-year career. And I hit a point in 2021 during the pandemic when, one, I was really blessed to be working remotely, but after I'd had all these cycles of burnout, I found myself again at a place where I was burned out, even after I had grown a lot in advocating for myself in my career and communicating what I needed. And I had a moment of clarity of thinking, wow, is my life just gonna be one draining job after another until I die? Which I didn't want that to be the answer.
I know
And
that feeling.
yeah, and so I that was really the impetus for me to say, "Okay, I don't have all the answers, but I wanna take and create some intentional space through a sabbatical to start getting clear on that for myself."
Absolutely. Kudos to you because it takes a lot of courage, I think, and resources, if we're being real, and self awareness to make such a big change to say, hey, I really need a break and to let go the fear that I think so many people encounter of losing momentum. I
Mhm.
know I stayed in a job that I wasn't super happy about, but because, of course, the check and the perks and where am I gonna go? And if I don't do this, then what? If I take a break, am I gonna lose out on opportunities? Am I gonna lose momentum and all these things? And I spent 3 years essentially being miserable before I actually took that break. And I think a lot of people do that. They either take a long time or they never take the break because of those fears. So you use the term career grief. Can you define it for those who are just now realizing that they've been feeling it?
Yeah. So I would describe career grief as the sorrow that emerges from painful experiences, trauma, or loss that folks experience, particularly in relationship to work or jobs. And I think it's really important to have a way to articulate those experiences because I don't think, at least in traditional corporate world, that's really given voice.
Right.
Even though we spend so much of our time at work, right? The average person may spend around 90,000 hours of their life at work. Sometimes you spend more time with people you work with than your loved ones.
Right.
And so to me, it's understandable that we may be having these really painful, impactful experiences through our jobs, but we're not always given space to articulate that. And so yeah, I realize that both for myself, but then also I, in my practice, as I've been seeing peers also struggling with those same types of experiences, whether it is now you're mid career and you're feeling disillusioned or you're feeling lost about like, all right, I've invested all this time in one path, but do I still want to do this? There are folks who have been in really toxic environments where they're just trying to recover themselves and their well being. So it can look a lot of different ways and it's deeply personal. I think it's unfortunately a common experience for a lot of people in corporate America.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you think this grief is so rarely acknowledged in traditional career spaces? I shared a bit about the fear. What do you think is maybe the deeper reason or some other reasons that this isn't really talked about?
Yeah, I think of a couple of things. On the individual level, I think it's related to what you'd mentioned in terms of fears, right? I think people fear being stigmatized for articulating something like that. And then maybe there being an idea that employers would think, oh, this person can't cut it. There's always the thing in the job descriptions in the fast paced environment and red flag. And the second thing that I'll say that's more kind of on the systemic and organizational level is that even though in recent years, I think there's been more work towards focusing on employee well being, I still think at the end of the day, companies are their primary aim is profit. And I still think folks are seen as workers first versus humans. And
Right.
so it's still this lens of it's about you and what the labor and talent that you're bringing towards the company's aims. And in that, they need you to be efficient. And things like grief is definitely not efficient, but it's
Right.
deeply human. And I think it's such a core part of how we or what I'll say is I think processing the grief and kind of entering this doorway of how it can transform you, I think is such a powerful and core part of how we can really thrive in our career in a way that is personal and that's resonant for us as individuals.
Absolutely. So, for you specifically, what was your own turning point? You spoke about it, but when grief overtook achievement specifically, where you felt, you know what, whether I achieve more or I'm seen as what I've heard in corporate, lazy or all the things because I want to take a break, or as you mentioned, can't cut it, quote unquote. What was that moment like for you when you said, "You know what? Regardless if people think that, it doesn't matter. I know what I feel, and I need to do this for me."
Yeah, to speak to that specific moment, I have to share a little bit of the picture of kind of what led up to it.
Sure.
A lot of my career, honestly, I experienced work as a very painful place. So I was a person that crying in bathroom stalls, got huddled
Yeah.
up in there trying to be as quiet as possible, working really long hours. There was one job where I'd work from 9 a.m. till like after midnight. These super marathon long hours, really just pushing like my body and my mind to the limit.
Right.
And in some of those cases, finding out that I was like being paid 40% below the market. So it was the combination of these experiences. And so when I got to that moment in 2021 of asking that question of, is this just going to be my life? I'd experienced so much pain that in terms of the ideas of, oh, people are going to think, oh, it must be nice you're taking a year off or you're lazy or can't cut it. I knew at that point that this was a matter of my life and well-being. So, did I want to keep trying to live up to other people's expectations at the expense of my own health? Or did I want to get serious about taking ownership of my life and well being and taking a bold step to do?
I think it's really beautiful that you listen to yourself in that way because we're not really taught how to do that. And especially in the workspace, it's really not encouraged. You're more so encouraged to abide by the rules that have been outlined for you and to follow that path and to follow the steps, if you will, to success or
Mhm,
happiness. You work
mhm.
here, you follow the rules, then you get your check and you go home. And I don't think white picket fences are a thing anymore, but whatever the version of that is now. And so I really admire your courage to sit with yourself and say, you know what, not only am I going to discontinue this lifestyle for myself and move into something healthy, better, and more aligned for me, but now I'm also going to help other people to do it as well. I love that you are guiding others through the same journey because I think that really helps for people to feel safe to do so. A lot of the women listening and maybe the people that you work with they're high achievers, right? And so it helps them to feel safe to know, okay, I'm taking a break, but I have a plan for this break.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have some type of plan. So, what did your sabbatical teach you about pace, permission, and presence?
I love that question. In terms of getting a bit of context on what I did for my sabbatical, so I took about, I guess, officially a year. I maybe nudged about a little
Yeah.
bit, but officially I took a year and I was based in the Atlanta area. I actually moved from the San Francisco Bay Area to Atlanta during my sabbatical. Most of it, I was just really focused on rest, but I also traveled to Colombia, to Portugal, to Ghana, which is where my dad's side of the family is from, and to Spain. And in terms of the experience, you spoke to just the privilege and I think the power of pausing and stillness. And that's what I really found during my sabbatical. What I invite others into is that it was really significant to me to get to move according to my own natural rhythms. And I don't think we realize it, but when we're working in a traditional job, even jobs that are pretty flexible, you still have to be within a certain time frame, right? You typically need to like wake up at a certain time. And some people also in cases where they're in back-to-back meetings where they're just cramming food in between the little breaks and
In there.
yeah, yeah, I've absolutely been there.
Yeah.
And so when you then create a space when it's, oh, wow, I can just tune into my body. And that in turn, I'm a big believer that your body is your main vessel for intuition. And so when you reconnect to your body, that reconnects you to your intuition. And I think I would say the key first step for folks in terms of when we think about alchemizing that pain, that career grief, because then your intuition, as you can keep connecting to it, can help you move forward and guide you in terms of what's the best next step for
Right.
you.
Absolutely. I love that you spoke on intuition and alchemizing energy. That is something that's so important. And we do it naturally many times. We don't even realize people who write and turn their pain into writing or painting or whatever it is. Can you speak a little bit more about that? Is that something that you felt was natural to you, or were there books that you read that really helped you to understand how your own energy and your body worked? Or again, was it something that maybe you learned in your family or it was more natural to you? How did you know that's what you were doing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say it comes from, so I'm a writer and also create music and sing. And so those are an avenues that I immediately go through if I'm working through confusion or pain. And it is the way that I try to make sense of those things and also try to articulate them. And that's what I also try to offer to folks in my community and folks that I work with is how do we leverage things like poetry and
Mhm.
music or really relevant, impactful quotes as vehicles of reflection so that then you can take up practices like journaling that help you, one, articulate, oh, I'm reading this poem and yes, that's it. That's what I'm experiencing.
Mhm.
And then you starting to ask the questions of what does that look like specifically for me? And
Right.
then starting to ask those questions of what's my next step? How do I transform what I'm going through? Even if it's the smallest kind of baby step,
Right.
starting to take those pieces. And so I think that there's just so much power in music and in writing and in creativity that folks can leverage in order to move through and reflect through painful experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm feeling you don't necessarily have to understand energetics and get into the meaning of intuition and all of the logistics of what's happening to practice it because your body naturally knows what to do. So, what are some practical ways people can begin to process career grief? I know we have some people watching who are in a process now where they are in a job that is really draining their soul. And we have other people who have already made the leap into entrepreneurship, but I've even experienced, and I know people watching have experienced, you can recreate some of the systems that you had in corporate back in your business, and you find yourself operating in the same way and having to go through the process of breaking up with your business or redesigning it in a way that is actually aligned with who you are and your energy, not who you were conditioned to be. So, what are some practical ways people can begin to process their grief? I know you mentioned writing, singing. What would you say?
Yeah. One thing that I would say is a groundwork piece is starting to create space for stillness, which I know can feel hard for the folks that are in those soul crushing jobs right now. And what I'd say is, and it's can be feel like a radical decision, but to start clearing your schedule in the ways that you can, which may mean some hard decisions if there are things that kind of you feel responsible for. But I think that it's so difficult to start even articulating what you're experiencing when your feelings are crushed. And I would say, too, for folks, even if it's not an option, say, to do a long career break or sabbatical, can you take an intentional vacation time from work to make that space where you can rest and reflect? Can you leverage something like short term or long term disability if that's available to you? The first thing I would say is creating that really that space to get still. And next practical thing that I would say would be going back to music. I feel like something that can be really helpful is doing music playlists, really connecting to songs that articulate the experience that you've been going through. And then another playlist that starts articulating where you want to move. There's a song from Brandy that I think it's called Freedom that I think just really I remember listening to it and it just helped open me up and
Yeah,
expand me onto the next phase. And I think also in terms of helping you feel all the emotions that you need to feel.
absolutely.
You hear the words of the song, and that can be an avenue for you to cry because you need to release that from your body. And the last thing that I'll say, and I touched on writing, but is to start creating and reconnecting with your intuition via consistent journaling. So even doing something as simple as each day, even if it's not longhand, can you just bullet journal, notice how you're feeling, what's coming up for you, and then just keep a track of that each day. Keep a track of what's shifting, what caused that to shift inside of you. Are you starting to see patterns and ways that you can support yourself in terms of not only being able to recognize what's happening inside of you, but then also starting to understand how you can shift your own energy. And that becomes this really powerful practice. We all experience the highs and lows
Right.
so that you keep moving forward in terms of your practices with that.
So I'm hearing a lot of self check in, self discovery, and self awareness, and not analyzing yourself to death because I've done that before. Where
Literally.
I joke and say I treat myself as a science experiment in a fun way because I enjoy it and that's the work that I do. But there are also moments where you have to pull back because you just need to be present. And sometimes you can't be present if you're always looking at every single detail of what's happening with you. So, what you mentioned about taking just small practices, taking daily steps to understand what's going on and doing something that feels simple, like listening to music.
Yeah.
It's not something that you have to analyze. You don't have to go and work too hard to have access to it. You find some songs and then you press play. And that can be a really beautiful way to release emotion, as you mentioned. I love those recommendations. What do you think happens to people when they finally create space to feel what their jobs have cost them? We know we have that grief and there can be some crying and maybe even some anger. What does that process look like? Whether you want to speak to your personal experience or maybe it's what your clients have experienced. But I think it's helpful to paint a picture for folks to understand what happens after, because that's where a lot of the fear lives.
Yeah, yeah. And it's an important question. And I think it can look like a whole spectrum of things since we're all so different and process things differently. I'll share from my experience, definitely a lot of anger. A lot of anger, a lot of sadness too. For me, in terms of how that looks was the anger portion kind of feeling really this rage, and I'll use the word rage toward these
Mhm.
different organizations where I felt like, oh, I felt like I just gave so much of myself. I gave my best self. And yet what I got in return was ending up broken in the end. I want to be honest that I think I don't think it's an easy journey to once you start creating the space to feel all of those things because it can be a lot of intense emotions, hard emotions. It can also be a lot of also reckoning with yourself. Like I had to also come to terms with being honest with myself in ways that there is a way I would find satisfaction being the hero, right?
Mhm.
I overextended myself again, and then people are like, oh, yeah, I did this. And there's this satisfaction. And
Yeah.
okay, I also played a part in it, right? And so I think essentially when you start to create this space to feel what you feel and to process the pain you've experienced, your demons will emerge.
All of them with flashlights looking at you.
They will emerge. And I think that's where leaning into support, like therapy, like coaches, and also even just community, just
Right.
folks and friendship, and also having the utmost compassion for yourself in the process. It's a tender journey,
Right.
and I think it's a slow journey. But I think that's where the power is, that when you really have the courage to face yourself and to face the pain, that's when you can really start, I love the word alchemize
Mhm.
that into to what's next and who am I.
Yeah. Yeah. So what was that process like when you were in the in between? You did some fun things too. It wasn't all grief and sadness and rage, right? So I'd love to talk a little bit about that. What were the opportunities that you had to get back in alignment with yourself to experience more joy during your travels? What was that feeling like?
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I travel solo often, and so one of the things that I love about that is I think you get the chance to connect with people in a different way because you're meeting new people, and so I had the chance to, say, connect with a group. When I went to Portugal, I did a tour that's called the African Lisbon Tour, all about kind of the impact and history of African peoples or African diaspora peoples in Lisbon, and met this group of this Black running group from London who were just so much fun. And it was one of those magical moments of travel and of solo travel where you're just following your impulses in terms of what you enjoy. And then you get to make these really resonant connections with people. They came to Atlanta last year and I got to reconnect with them. And when I've gone to London, I've reconnected with some of them as well. And I think that also speaks to, I'll say, another aspect of healing, which is fun. I think is fun and play and community.
Right.
And to your point, I think we can't just, I guess we could just stay in the tears the whole time. But I think there's also something deeply nourishing that we need in terms of opportunities to laugh,
Right.
opportunities to just have fun with people and connect with people. That was not about all of the a certain agenda or anything like that, but it's just getting to enjoy presence. And so I think it is an important part of as you move through the pause and the stillness, that you also create spaces for joy and for pleasure and for things that just feel nourishing and good for you as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's the fun part of these things, right?
Yeah.
Or the fun part of the process, getting back in touch with yourself and allowing yourself the space to feel free. And I think there's a lot that you discover about yourself as well that was maybe hidden from you in the spaces you were in previously because it wasn't allowed. It wasn't permitted. I don't feel, at least in a lot of experiences in corporate, I was very blessed to work in a corporate space that prioritized fun moments. But I know a lot of companies that happens, and it's also there's a cost for that. I say that to say, even then, you're still at work and you're still a version of yourself that's not fully free. And so being able to do that, especially through travel and meeting other people who maybe are living differently as well. Like I
Mhm.
absolutely love Portugal. It's a place I keep telling myself maybe I should live here. I loved it that much.
Mhm.
And I feel the culture there, they're already leading in a new way in terms of how they live. And so I'm curious to know from you, what does intuitive, heart centered leadership look like? Especially, I think, in the United States, it's a little bit different. I think there are some places and cultures that are already adopting this because
Mhm.
they're naturally living in more human centered ways, like countries that have nap time or places close early so you can have dinner with your family. They're already on that path. We're not fully there yet. So, what would you say intuitive, heart centered leadership looks like?
The first thing I'll lead by saying is that, to your point, I think in the US, it can actually take a lot of courage to lead intuitively and in a heart centered way. I think that maybe there's a stigma like
Right.
associated to if you perhaps lead like in a softer way or in a way that isn't seen as the more direct form of leadership. What I think that looks like is that it's creating space for people's humanity, whether that is if you're someone maybe who's either directly managing folks or even with your colleagues, right? I think taking the time to understand who are they and what makes them tick,
Right.
because everybody's so different. And I think sometimes in corporations, and again, it can vary and can vary in the team, but sometimes there can be you're going so fast that it's like everyone kind of needs to all move in a certain way, but how can you consider, oh, that this person, this is how they're wired. This is what
Right.
motivates them. This is where they really thrive. These are their strengths. Oh, this is an area where they need to grow. And then how can you, maybe in the areas that they need to grow, how can you encourage folks in that? And then the areas where they're strong, how can you really help lean into that? So I think aspects like that. I think also creating space for, and I recognize that this is challenging, but there's so much happening culturally, geopolitically. How can you be mindful of that for the folks that you're working with? We're not just working in a vacuum of logging on or we're going into the office, but there are a lot of really, really challenging things that are happening. And so how can you create space for those types of, even if it's not getting into the nitty-gritty of politics or something, but just creating space for folks to maybe, hey, you know what? There's a lot happening. It's intense day. Log off early.
Right.
How can you create space for folks to be able to take care of themselves, recognizing that we are human, but we're not machines. So we're going to be impacted
Right.
by all of these realities that are happening. And so I think those are some of the ways of leading that I think will be powerful as we continue to move forward when I anticipate there are only more changes coming.
Right.
And so as there are more changes coming, I think it means even more that what we've taken for granted in terms of systems or the way things work are shifting. And so to me, that means even more so we need to lean into intuition. We need to lean into a different type of collective wisdom.
Right.
Um, and that really requires digging deep into yourself and reflecting so that you are able to lead yourself and then in turn lead those that you work with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an interesting time, and that is an understatement. There's a lot of change and transformation happening, and I feel collectively we're seeing a lot of external change, but also internally, people are very much shifting because we can see, I feel, the results of living in ways where we haven't been in touch with ourselves, where we haven't been led by intuition or collective wisdom. And we're now living in, I feel, a more mechanistic
Mhm.
society that really excludes the human experience in a harmful way. I'm looking forward to the other side of it, where we are establishing new community driven routes and that can meet us where we are today and creating new ways of connecting with one another, with connecting with ourselves in alignment with this new world that's being birthed, while I think an old one is really dying in front of our eyes. And it's a fascinating time from a human experience perspective. But with that, the process to get where we need to go gonna take a lot, and I feel the only thing that we'll really have is ourselves. The only piece at the end of the day that you can really control is your mind and your body and your intuition, so it's even more critical now, more than ever, to make sure that your home, this one vessel that you have, is a safe space for you, and making sure that to the best of your ability, you create an environment around that to keep your mind, body, and spirit really protected and safe. I know one thing that really comes up for people is, where's the money coming from? How do I prepare? What about the money, especially in times as of now? What's one thing you would say to someone who really needs to take that leap? They need the break, but they're concerned about finances. Maybe it's something they can do to prepare, maybe their resources. I know you mentioned shorter long term disability, looking into that with the company. But what's something that you would say for someone who's really worried about that piece?
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's a totally understandable question and concern. I would say start with what is readily accessible. If it's really not immediately accessible to take a long break, because that does actually also require planning and saving up in advance. I would say look into, as I mentioned, look into the short or long-term disability options. And that obviously varies based on your employer, what benefits you have, and in what state you're in. But I think that gives an option of you can get some space for yourself, and the amount of time can vary, but it can be a number of months where you're still getting some pay in, but you're also getting to take a step back from your work. So that is a meeting in the middle of giving yourself a little bit more of an extended space without kind of the stress of if you quit a job and you don't necessarily have other income coming in. What I'd also say is, and I have a free burnout reflection guide for folks that are in this situation, is also start practically looking at, are there ways that financially you can cut back? Are there things that you're spending money on that you really don't need? Or I'm not necessarily saying you have to go totally austere, but
Right.
are there things that you don't need or that like it doesn't really support you or bring you joy that you can start cutting back on those things? And also just understanding what are your baseline expenses, right? If you take away the extras of what you might be. So things like your housing, your transportation, your food, your medical expenses,
Right.
what's core baseline so that you can start moving yourself into a position where you're like, okay, I'm not living at the top of, what I'm making. So then I'm giving myself some financial breathing room,
Right.
so that then you can start to create options for yourself. And even if it's just as you take potentially the disability option, you can open up an account and just start putting some money away every month. And then it'll be there and growing so that as you keep proceeding in future and make decisions, you can start giving yourself some financial options in terms of that.
Yeah. Great advice. Thank you for that.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. A fun experience, I like to call it, at the end of our session. I just started this a few episodes ago. It's called Rapid Fire Recess. I'm going to ask you 4 questions, rapid fire, first response that comes to your mind. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just for fun. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. A belief you had to grieve and release to move forward.
That work has to be drudgery and toilsome, and that I have to sacrifice my well being.
So good. A place from your sabbatical that changed how you see yourself.
Donna,
I love that. A book or quote that continues to anchor you.
ooh, Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola-Estes.
That's a sign I need to read it. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. That was
But I've heard so many amazing things and it keeps popping up. So it's time. Okay, last question. One thing you do when you feel misaligned.
listen to music.
Yes, so soothing. And your playlist, right?
Yeah, my playlist. That's exactly what I do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And a final word for our listeners today. If someone is feeling stuck, numb, or afraid of what might surface if they slow down, what would you want to say to them?
I would say take your time. You don't have to. I really believe that our bodies keep us safe and that our bodies let us know when we are ready to dive deep into something. So don't feel in a rush. Take your time and connect into to support that can help you hold that grief with you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Where can people find you? How can they connect with you?
Yeah. So folks can always find me at my website, nyamadodoadji.com. I also hang out on the LinkedIn and on Substack as well. So in particular on Substack, if you're wanting to dive deeper into reflections on kind of life and work, as well as affirmations and reflection questions, check me out on Substack. You can find me at she speaks softly.substack.com.
Ah, beautiful. Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your wisdom. This has been such a beautiful and insightful conversation. I know that so many people listening are going to feel guided to maybe take that leap and at least feel more prepared from what you shared and maybe even come work with you and seek your guidance.
Yeah,
Yes.
thanks.
So thank you so much. In the meantime, stay aligned. Bye bye.